Hi, I'm Dr. Arlen Myers. I'm President and CEO of the Society of Physician Entrepreneurs, and welcome to this session on blockchain. I'm pleased to have as our guest a friend and colleague, Wendy Charles, who is a research scientist at Burst IQ. So thanks for joining us, Wendy.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me, Arlen.
Yeah, sure. And just a couple of housekeeping notes. If you have questions or you want to ask something, put it in the chat. And the learning objectives for this session really are basically three. One is to kind of understand, what is blockchain and sort of the technical issues. Second is to kind of understand some of the challenges and opportunities in the business of blockchain, and particularly, obviously, how it applies to sick care. And then I thought we'd have some thoughts about the entrepreneurial journey and what blockchain entrepreneurship is all about. So should be a fun session, and we look forward to what you have to say. So, Wendy, let's start out with sort of the magic of blockchain and what all that is about. So, maybe you can explain to us what is blockchain and why should we even pay attention to this?
Oh, sure. To do so, I'm going to show some slides because I think pictures tell the story more effectively than words. So I'm going to share my screen and then add to the presenter mode. Okay, so can you see the full presentation? Great.
Okay.
Okay, so I always have to start out with a disclaimer that these are my views and not necessarily the views of Burst IQ. But since I do work for a company that specializes in blockchain for healthcare, I'll be talking about those experiences and not necessarily in a promotional setting. So first, we're going to go into kind of the nuts and bolts of what blockchain is and what makes it different than traditional databases. So first and foremost, there's a lot of misconceptions about blockchain's association with Bitcoin. So blockchain itself is not a cryptocurrency, but different cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin do operate on a blockchain infrastructure. It's best instead to think about blockchain as a set of tools and technologies. There's a common misconception that blockchain is one item or one thing that we can talk about in uniformity, but it really is almost as diverse as the term database. So one good way to think about it is how we have the relationships of different types of systems. So you can see that Bitcoin is only one type of cryptocurrency, and cryptocurrency is only one type of blockchain. In fact, cryptocurrency only comprises 15% of current uses of blockchain today. And spreading up, there are other types of distributed ledger technologies, and that's what I will be explaining. And then these are really all forms of data management. So one of the critical takeaways from this session is that when people talk about blockchain, it's just really important to put it into the context of how complex it can be. And it's really a set of technologies and tools instead of any one thing. So next, blockchain doesn't use tables or fields. And I know that's kind of a challenging concept for those of us who have been in healthcare and life sciences because we are so used to having data tables. But instead, blockchain uses ledgers. And for those of us who took accounting before it was electronic, we are familiar with using a ledger to record each new activity. And so very much in the same thinking, blockchain technologies use ledgers, and for every single activity, there's just another line. As a next component, blockchain uses cryptography. And so one way to think about it is that for any type of input, whether it be pieces of data, it can be images, small images, it can be could be an entire data set. As long as it fits within the constraints of what the system can manage, any type of input is run through a hash function. And then there is a hash output. Some people call it a hash sum. And because this algorithm is so sophisticated, that people cannot reverse engineer from the output to figure out what the input is. And when this, anytime someone might try to change this input, it would of course change what the output is. When this output is unaltered, we can have more confidence that there was no change to the input. So now the way these hashes are critical with understanding how blocks are connected. So when a batch of transactions or data entries is combined, then there is a hash created of the entire block itself. In its simplest terms, it's actually much more complicated than that. But when it creates a hash of the block, then the hash of that block is stored in the header of the next block. And then for each block subsequent to that. This is one of the critical factors that also makes it tamper resistant and tamper evident, because if someone would try to go into this block and change any of the contents, it would change the hash of that block. And because the hash of that block is also contained in the next block of the series, then it would change the hash of that block, and so on down the chain. Some people refer to blockchain as being immutable, but that term is kind of overstated. The National Institutes of Standards and Technology instead refer to blockchain as being tamper resistant and tamper evident. Even with some of the large blockchains used for cryptocurrency, it's theoretically possible to change the contents. But for healthcare blockchains that we use, they are designed to have some features to be able to be modified and over time potentially even be deleted for performance purposes.
Can you explain, can you go back 1 second? So could you define tamper evident?
Yeah, so if someone were trying to change, you would see a break in the chain, and so it would be visible upon audit.
I see. So it leaves evidence that someone was trying to fool with
That's
it.
correct. That's correct.
And so, well, I'm sorry, I'll ask you at the end of this session.
Okay,
Right?
sounds good. All right, so there are a couple different types of storage, and this is a valuable discussion when it comes to healthcare data. When we consider all of the types of data stored and accumulated from healthcare, the data come in and then they go through this hashing algorithm where it's encrypted, and some organizations prefer to store health data what's called off-chain. And that means that only those hashes that I was talking about that result from the algorithm are stored on the blockchain, and then they contain a pointer to where the raw data or files are stored in a data lake, which is a very flexible type of data storage mechanism. So some people believe that data are more secure when they are stored in this type of data lake. But the concern is that what happens if the data are deleted in the data lake? You would then have a hash recording the deletion, but it doesn't necessarily protect the data. So we're seeing more and more healthcare organizations move to on-chain storage, and this is actually the mechanism that BurstIQ has used for 4 years. The actual data points are encrypted and stored directly on the blockchain, surrounded by what we call metadata, which is really data about the data. And each data point is encrypted, for BurstIQ, encrypted individually. The way that performance is managed is that there are instead subchains that can come off in order to manage the scalability and volume of transactions. So it'd be interesting to see how much more of the healthcare blockchain space goes into on-chain storage, but it seems like more and more organizations are putting more data on-chain. So the next component is that we call it a distributed ledger technology because of how the data are stored. Now, traditionally in healthcare, we store data in a central location like a central server, and sometimes organizations do decentralized where there's a hub. But the big concern is what happens when the server goes down. And when I worked at Denver Health, our server went down at least once a quarter. And then all access to the electronic health records stopped, and nobody could access any of the data stored in any of our servers. So blockchain utilizes distributed storage, and this is part of the term of distributed ledger technology is that the locations of storage are distributed across many different servers, or sometimes it could be computers. And the point is that there is no single source of failure. This form of redundancy provides tremendous protection to the system and allows for communication among what we call nodes. So next, blockchains can be public, private, hybrid. Some people categorize a consortia as a different type, but the earlier types of blockchains were the public blockchains used for cryptocurrency, where pretty much anyone can join. And the point was that the transactions were transparent so that individuals or organizations could verify that someone had indeed transferred cryptocurrency from one person to another. Users were only known by their public key, which is this long string, alphanumeric string. In healthcare, we utilize private blockchains primarily because the data need to remain private, and individuals can only access private data when they are granted permission. Sometimes organizations do collaborate, and that's when they form consortia in order to manage data privately. And there's another type of blockchain that's increasingly being utilized, which is really a hybrid. And there may be a private blockchain connected to a public blockchain, such as Ethereum, in order to provide additional attestation to the data. There are many types of blockchain platforms too, reinforcing the fact that blockchain just isn't any one thing. Some of these are used primarily for finance or different types of cryptocurrency, and some are designed for private storage. There's one of particular note of private sources. The blockchain project Hyperledger is probably the most widely used. We call it a project because it's not a company and it's not a platform, but it's a project where thousands of individuals and organizations have come together to improve this code base in order to make more private blockchain code open source. So in order to get all of these nodes to agree with each other, there needs to be some form to get them to come to a consensus about what is the newest information and what is accurate information to add. There are currently 69 different methods published about reaching consensus. And the one associated with Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, most cryptocurrencies, but that was the earliest, was called proof of work. And some people still call it mining. And that's when they compete against each other to solve a really complicated puzzle. And the first to solve the puzzle gets to create the block. This is the only type, or the primary type, of consensus mechanism that uses a lot of electricity and is bad for the environment. But it's important to know that these other forms of consensus mechanisms may have very different mechanisms of reaching agreement. And proof of stake, for example, is almost as fast and uses about the same amount of electricity as a central server. So when some people say, oh, blockchain is terrible for our environment, you shouldn't be using that, it's important. An important takeaway is that it depends on what type of consensus mechanism and how the computers have to process information, and that many of these do not use the same amount of electricity as those used for, say, Bitcoin.
So how do you, could you just go back 1 second?
Sure.
Again, so the definition of consensus mechanism is, how does everyone decide what is going to be used in the blockchain?
Well, it's how do the nodes know which data is the most current, and how do they determine which data are valid to add? And so this is a business decision for the designers of the blockchain to determine how they want to make sure that there's not only agreement, but there are additional considerations such as speed, which is a form of scalability, could be for security, as well as the nature of distribution. So it's it's really determination about how you manage those nodes and how what mechanism would best serve your specific business case for what you're trying to use blockchain for. And for blockchain storing healthcare data, we typically need very high speed storage and queries in order to be able to access that information. So healthcare organizations are moving toward consensus mechanisms that are designed differently in order to have these high-speed transactions.
Okay.
Okay, and going on. So next, smart contracts can be added to blockchains. This is one of the most popular features of the newer blockchains, especially with regard to healthcare and life sciences, because they can offer some features more easily than hard-coded software programs. So when people hear the term smart contracts, it's important to note that these are not necessarily contracts and they're not necessarily smart. What this is a segment of code that's added on top of the blockchain in order to execute automatically when certain features are met. And they are designed to improve automation of a feature, such as automate a payment, for example, when a product is received. And when it's designed to automate, the hope is that it decreases the type of error we might see when a human has to do something manually. And because these are stored on the blockchain, it can be transparent to those individuals or organizations authorized to see it. And it can improve security and speed. The only caution is that smart contracts aren't perfect. And when designed by a human, there can be bugs in the code. So last explanation of blockchain, it is the back end of solution. So some people say, well, I've never interacted with a blockchain. Well, you probably have, but you didn't know. Normally, there are actually many different ways that blockchains can be designed, but most of the time there are software applications that a user would interact with so that there's a nice user interface where people can manage the system and data entry in a very comfortable, user-friendly way. And then these systems can connect with a blockchain, which is comprised of smart contracts and governance layers, as well as the chain itself. So this is the diagram that BurstIQ often uses in order to explain that it's we typically don't design all-in-one solutions, but we design the blockchain layers, and organizations can connect their favorite software programs or can create new programs that would interact with the blockchain in order to benefit from the features that a blockchain offers.
What's a DLT?
A DLT is a distributed ledger technology, and it's a form of blockchain that I had talked about earlier that has many of those features of distribution and ledgers.
Okay, great.
Okay, so
yeah,
that's
thanks.
the answer.
Thanks for the overview. So if anybody has any questions about what she just described, just put it in the chat, but I have a couple. One is, I mean, everyone realizes that the amount of data emanating from various places that have something to do with someone's health is almost infinite. Mm-hmm. And is expanding rapidly. Internet of Medical Things, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all those sources you mentioned. And so we're seeing ways, and some are saying, well, where are we going to put all this stuff? Mm-hmm. So examples of places that you put the stuff are enterprise data warehouses, federated channels, cloud, data lakes, et cetera. So what is the benefit of, or is blockchain an alternative way to store and access all of this data versus all these other places? Because the pitch now is cloud, whether it's on-prem, edge, on whatever. So is blockchain another place to store all this stuff?
No, that's an interesting question, Erlen, and it has a nuanced answer. So with when we interact with clients, a big part of the discussion is to determine what their business needs are. and which is a big part about what we'll talk about in the next section. What exactly are they trying to achieve that they can't already do with their existing systems? So it's not always about where to store something, and blockchain is typically cloud-based, not always, but typically cloud-based. It's really about what are they trying to do with the data that they are collecting? Are they trying to process it in a different way? Are they trying to bring together disparate sources of data? Are they trying to automate some features? And so that really determines exactly how the storage is determined. The blockchains can be designed to have very sophisticated storage mechanisms too. So for example, with those that are designed for on-chain storage, some people say, oh, how could you ever manage the scalability? But there are very feasible methods for creating what we call side chains or subchains. And there's typically, like when we have designed blockchains for health information exchanges, we've created a separate individual chain for each person. And because of the way that we have designed and mapped data, it still queries at 90% of the speed of a central server. So, and we have clients who have stored millions upon millions of data points, and they haven't experienced any degradation of speed. So it's really about the business case that people are trying to achieve and how best to manage the data in order to achieve that specific value proposition.
Okay. And before we go on to the business part, how does blockchain impact, for example, robotic process automation, like automating prior authorization?
So when you say prior authorization, are you talking about like authorization for uses of healthcare?
Yeah. So for example, I mean, the two biggest bugaboos that people complain about are the electronic medical record and prior authorization.
Sure.
You got to call somebody up at an insurance company, a Mother May I, and you got to get a note from your doctor and all that. So it really just, people are just are annoyed by it. And so the point is, one of the uses of robotic process automation is to automate prior authorization. So you don't have to hang on a phone for a half an hour to some person who gives you a hard time.
Yeah.
So can blockchain do that?
We have actually designed that exact process, prior authorization, for a large pharmaceutical company. The goal was to have a pool of data available for managing the data training set, applying artificial intelligence, and applying automation to the process. And so it absolutely can be used in order to reduce a lot of the manual processes, as well as make faster decision making as part of the determination about prior auth. So absolutely, it's not just doable, it's being done.
Okay. So I have a question. Is your chain, and I guess I guess she means blockchain, public or private?
The BurstIQ platform is private.
Okay. Okay, well, let's move on to so now that we have some understanding of sort of the basics of the technical stuff, let's move on to the business of blockchain. So maybe you can walk us through some of the opportunities and challenges about the business of blockchain.
Great. I'm going to share my screen again so I can share some slides. I often think it's easier to communicate with images.
Yeah, that's good. We can see you.
Yeah, great. Okay, so I'm going to first tell you about a real world case that helps understand and exemplifies how blockchain is used in real world settings. So starting out, there has been a need for improving food safety. And so Walmart undertook blockchain technology in order to track the food supply chain. So previously what would happen is in the food supply chain, farmers would pick their produce, it would get jumbled in transit using shippers, it would all get mixed in the distribution warehouse, and no store had any idea where the produce was coming from. But the big concern is that what happens when there's a recall? And each recall of romaine lettuce in the United States had cost nationally all restaurants and grocers $6 billion collectively. So Walmart partnered with IBM to create an IBM food trust where all of the handoffs of leafy green produce, starting with leafy green produce, but also with a number of other forms of produce now, it's tracked on the blockchain. So just using smartphones, that batches of produce are marked with QR codes or barcodes so that they can be tracked. And every time that there's a handoff, it's tracked. And when it gets to the store, then the produce manager can simply track, use the QR codes and barcodes to see the entire chain of produce transactions and determine instantly a process that was 6 seconds, would take up to 6 days, now takes a matter of seconds in order to see which farm produce came from. So this is a big innovation. Most people don't realize that when you go to Walmart and you walk into the produce section, that the food safety is being managed by blockchain. And now each store can know instantly which farm their produce came from and be able to immediately remove contaminated produce if it's determined to come from a contaminated farm. So having said that, it helps to create a real image of how blockchain can be used in many industries today. Now, starting in healthcare, as of 2018 already, there really aren't newer statistics, but as of 2018, almost 3 years ago, 49% of global healthcare companies stated that they were developing blockchain solutions, and 70% of life sciences organizations plan to have one or more blockchain projects in place by last year, which is the majority. So some have said, well, how come I don't see it? How come I don't have much visibility into that? Well, think about the growth of any new industry as being like a tree. It grows both upward and downward in order to gain traction. And so many organizations are developing blockchain-based products, but they are getting grounded in the technology and getting a firm foundation about how they plan to use it so that they can scale up very responsibly and safely. And so, and some of our clients at Burst IQ, for example, don't advertise the fact that they are using blockchain because it's just not part of their product messaging. It's like they sell the car by giving pictures of a car. It's not really cars, but in healthcare. But you can imagine with a car, using the analogy of a car, they sell the image of the car. They sell how the car can drive and what it feels like, but they don't necessarily sell what's under the hood. So it's just important to know how widespread the usage is becoming, even though you may not see in your everyday life. But I do hope that you remember that when you go to Walmart, you are interacting with the blockchain. So if Walmart can track its produce, of course, many drug manufacturers are now turning to blockchain to manage their drug supply chains. In fact, the FDA itself is leading an initiative with about 25 pharmaceutical companies to use blockchain to manage the supply chain processing as part of the Drug Supply Chain Security Act. Other uses are to enable system interoperability. And this is just an example where each of these three major entities has their own storage. So this would be like the off-chain storage that we talked about, but they are much more able to share information with each other because they can use the blockchain technologies. A very popular thing that I do with life sciences companies is help them integrate data silos, because there are so many different sources of systems that don't necessarily talk to each other. But using the foundational connections available in the blockchain technologies that we design, it's much easier for these disparate systems to talk to each other so that they can pull data for analyses. Another component that became really critical during COVID was the ability to connect data from electronic systems to do virtual trials. And so data from a number of different electronic sources can be pulled together automatically using application programming interfaces and connected using blockchain so that you can have a holistic picture of how a research subject is doing over a trial. A next consideration, I talked about connecting researchers and innovation, but this really can be any groups or individuals who need to share information in a trusted way when they don't necessarily trust each other. And a critical component with research is that there has to be an audit trail in order to demonstrate data integrity. And so this is a feature that enables much more capability and trust within a collaborative environment. Another thing that we're doing right now with some laboratories is creating enterprise resource planning and automating a lot of the processes for data exchange when there are disparate systems all involved in blood processing, for example. And so this is automated using blockchain, which saves a lot of money. So so those are just some examples to start, but it's worthwhile to talk about specifically why blockchain. This is a cartoon that says, my team has created a very innovative solution, but we're still looking for a problem to go with it. Well, of course, blockchain should be addressing a need, not looking for a need. And it's really important to first understand what's already being done and why isn't that sufficient. So starting out, it's important, as I was mentioning a little earlier, what are the critical problems that an organization needs to address? And so, of course, in healthcare, we often operate with thin margins. And so we're always looking for ways to reduce costs while still maintaining high quality. And so these are just some examples of some critical problems that organizations are looking to address. And then after we identify what are those critical problems, it's important to ask, well, can blockchain solve these better than existing options? Because sometimes that's not the case. Blockchain doesn't solve everything. And it's better if something is an off-the-shelf solution that can address their problems well, then that would be a good starting point. So some of these common needs addressed by blockchain that go beyond what traditional database systems typically offer pertain to governance, such as managing data and rules and consent and access across a system. Multi-party access when there may be multiple organizations that need to be involved somehow in a project or exchanging information, the ability to report, and also having integrity with that data as a single source of truth. So one of the tools that I find very valuable, and I probably refer to this at least once a week, is this map of values that was produced by the World Economic Forum in a paper 2019 by lead author Sheila Warren. This just helps by explaining what are those key dimensions in blockchain that and what capabilities are offered within those specific dimensions. And then you go down into the specific value drivers. So what is it again? How can we address those problems we've identified to make sure that this is the right technology and the right solution for addressing those problems? And so this really helps plan and the talking points and the strategies about metric collection to demonstrate that you're designing the right solution and will have the right types of outcomes. So then from additional pictures, it's important to determine those business drivers and regulatory drivers. In healthcare, regulatory compliance is paramount. And so many organizations say, how can you possibly meet HIPAA? These are important questions, and blockchains can be designed for HIPAA. Just as an example, the Burst IQ blockchain has been independently certified by an outside organization as being HIPAA compliant. And then there are addressing those particular challenges, like technical challenges may involve connections to existing systems. It could, of course, we have opposition to change, to almost any new change that could affect an environment and could involve workflow and business and legal regulatory challenges. So one way to think about how we approach it from a business and productivity perspective is considering how we are ultimately adding blockchain to an existing ecosystem, which is much larger than any technology in itself. So I am going to stop there and receive any questions you may have.
Great. So you can take the slide down if you
Okay.
would. We have a couple questions, and Marina, you have a couple of questions that you asked. I'm wondering if you can unmute yourself and ask the question.
I'm just wondering what's the point of using the blockchain? Sorry, hold on. Okay. Oops.
Can you introduce yourself and tell us who you are?
Sure. Oops. I'm trying to turn it off, so hold on. Okay. I work on a blockchain. I'm trying to solve the issue of digital identity that is going to be relevant.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so your question is?
My question is, what's the point of using private blockchain instead of using a database? Because every single thing that you can do in a privately held blockchain, you can do in a database.
Yeah, that's a. I have heard that argument before, and I hope that this is an opportunity to shed some light on that potential. You could, in theory, hard code many of those features into a software program, and some organizations have chosen to do it that way. The organizations that we work with that use the private blockchain have determined that a database cannot manage the nature of permissioning and rules governance that they need to implement across the ecosystem. So, for example, with many types of healthcare organizations that utilize blockchain in order to automate some process. So we can pull information in from the electronic health record automatically. We perform automatic mapping. And then there's a granular consent process that where individuals, patients can log in and have they can have very granular control over how their information is used and shared, and can change it dynamically, which is it's just a feature that has been very difficult for many databases to determine, to design in a way that's really efficient. Another is rules-based governance. So there are layers and layers and layers of governance over many private blockchains. These determine what each organization can do. Regulatory compliance is designed in some of these systems. Like we have clients in Australia that have, in the country of Australia, the health data cannot leave the country. And so we have set up barriers in governance that do not permit individuals to share. There's also governance rules that can be built in about what can be done with certain types of data, and just using very simple pull-down menus, it can have very flexible data management strategies for replacing identifiers. And also we connect with identity management solutions that are much more sophisticated. So those are just some examples of how our partners have found that using blockchain is like combined 3 different companies and 3 different solutions all in one, and we're able to give them some solutions that they just couldn't design in a reasonable way on their own.
So with all due respect, every little thing you said could easily is much easier to design in a database than on a blockchain. Blockchain originally was designed for a consensus mechanism where parties that don't trust each other could trust each other. It's basically an algorithm that allows untrusting parties to do business together without worrying about it. Once it becomes
if I could interrupt you, we want to entertain some other questions. I think your questions are great, but I want to have an opportunity for others to ask. So maybe you can have this conversation with Wendy offline. Thanks for your comment. Andrew, do you want to ask a question?
Yes, sir. So my question is, also, Wendy, really appreciate your presentation. I was hoping to get a little more information.
Andrew, let me interrupt you. Introduce yourself and tell us who you are. Hi,
my name is Andrew Morrissey, and I'm a second-year medical student, and I live in Atlanta, Georgia.
Okay, great. And your question is?
My question is, what is a REST-based API interface, and what are a few examples of how they're used currently in healthcare?
Oh, sure. So this is a type of application programming interface. So it's a type of code that allows electronic systems to communicate with each other. And there are, with any system, there may be hundreds of different application programming interfaces that are available and can be used to connect. And what they do is they help design the flow of data, and also they can be used to manage security as well.
Great.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And one final question, and that is that you indicated that blockchain is good for handoffs and tracking handoffs.
Yes.
So I would assume that it would be applicable to medical handoff, patient handoffs, to address the problem of referral leaks, dropped handoffs, missed appointments, you name it. So a patient goes from, instead of an orange, you're from the field to the warehouse, you're tracking a patient from the hospital to a skilled nursing facility or wherever they go. Is that true?
It can be designed to be so. It just depends on what the business case is. We have some partners currently that are designing personal health record systems for their patient base, so that patients can take their it's goes a lot further than taking their medical record with them on their phone. It's also about automating a lot of the processes with information exchange, as well as automating the referral process, as well as the payment process and payment authorization process. So these are features, especially with the ability to create the thinking of a supply chain, data as a supply chain over the course of transactions, and having multiple organizations potentially involved and only be able to see certain components. Yes, it can be designed that way. The biggest obstacle that we actually face with healthcare information is not the technology, it's the politics. And getting organizations to agree to share data with each other, or agree to allow a connection to their electronic health record system.
Yeah, if you didn't have to deal with the rules and the people, it would be pretty easy.
It would be easier, but
right. Okay, yeah. So we've discussed the technology, we've discussed some of the use cases and the business issues, and so now let's move on to the third part, which has to do with the entrepreneurial journey. So I would imagine several people in this audience are interested in, well, how did you wind up doing what you're doing? So maybe you can just tell us your story.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I am a classically trained scientist. I started out my career actually in neuropsychology, and been involved in clinical research and operations for 30 years. So part of my career started out in conducting research and trying to manage research electronically. And my early involvement was with cognitive aging. And I had a mentor that was hired by the banks to make ATMs more user-friendly for older adults. And that's where I first became interested in use of technologies for improving a person's experience. The other half of my career was regulatory compliance and interacting regularly with the FDA and federal authorities about new drug submissions, new device. And a big part of the emerging technologies is that most people don't realize that software can be regulated as a medical device. Standalone software and artificial intelligence algorithms can also be regulated by the FDA. As with my PhD in clinical science with a specialty in health information technology, my own research was about mobile technologies and how we can potentially reduce healthcare costs by allowing patients to go home sooner while still being connected and observed electronically. So here's how I got involved in blockchain. So I attended a mobile health conference in 2017 that was attended almost exclusively by pharmaceutical executives. And I was not a pharmaceutical executive, but I was very interested in how mobile technologies were being utilized in pharmaceutical trials. And even though the conference was not about blockchain, every single speaker at the conference talked about blockchain and the importance of knowing more about blockchain technologies and the impact that it can have on different aspects of pharmaceutical trials. I learned at that conference that almost every single pharmaceutical there was developing its own private blockchain in order to utilize some of the unique features to manage many of their processes with clinical trials. So I was completely hooked. The concept of learning more about blockchain technologies just took over my life. I attended every single blockchain meetup in the Denver area. I read every book that was available. I took the edX and Coursera classes because there really wasn't formal education available about blockchain at that point. And I volunteered on many many local, then national, and now international committees in order to drive the thinking, education, and advocacy about utilization of blockchain, specifically in life sciences. And I started publishing. And so that all led me, I had to do all of this work on my own in order to just to be qualified, to be considered for a position in a blockchain company. And so but 2 years ago, I approached Frank Wakota, the CEO of Burst IQ, at a meetup. And I literally told him that he needed to hire me. And I had my elevator pitch ready, and I explained to him what I felt like I could offer to his company to create a much broader market in life sciences research. And he said he said he wanted to talk to me. So, and that's how the position was created for me. So for those who are interested in getting involved in blockchain and learning more, there are a lot of tools available now. There are a lot of literature sources. In the chat, if you'll go to the very top, please note that I added some resources for you. So there is, for those who would like to continue this conversation, there will be a Blockchain and Healthcare Today event that Burst IQ is hosting next week. It's free. It's where one of my colleagues will be talking about use of blockchain to manage vaccine administration and tracking, and which is a very common use for private blockchains right now. And I provided a really basic introduction to blockchain, but most importantly, on that sheet, on the second page, is a lot of resources available so that you can look at those and see which of those may be helpful to you to learn more about how to get involved in the blockchain community and amass more knowledge.
That's great. Thanks for sharing your story. And I guess you need to, the link you just mentioned is at the top of the chat. So if you're interested in getting that, go to the top of the chat and you'll see 2 PDF files where you can find that. And one final comment before we leave is, so where are the hot jobs in blockchain? I mean, all we're hearing about is reskilling and digital health, I mean, do you have to have a PhD in computer science to do this, or what do you need? What do you need?
Well, and it's interesting you mentioned the market. So in 2020, LinkedIn had listed blockchain as the top most sought after skill, most difficult to acquire for experience of a candidate in the job market. Let's see, in 2019, the Digital Chamber of Commerce specified that blockchain was the single most sought after skill, an unmet need for many companies. So of the blockchain positions that are posted, most of them pertain to programmers or engineers who have some familiarity with organizing an architecture stack. But there are still needs for people to communicate and help with design. I am really one of the only people in the world who brings together regulatory compliance and blockchain for life sciences. And there's just such a huge need for people who understand the ecosystem, especially in healthcare, and can communicate to healthcare executives about how blockchain can fit into their current ecosystem. But it's really important to understand that ecosystem and understand where their pain points are and understand the impact to workflow and the conservative nature. So, you know, for those of you who are interested in, have a background in healthcare, you're entrepreneurial, and you would like to get involved, learn as much as you can about the blockchain technology, because there is a huge need to be able to communicate using healthcare terminology and understanding that ecosystem to help healthcare organizations understand how it can best impact them.
Right. There's been a request that you repost those 2 PDFs, because I guess that doesn't appear in the chat if you are a late entry into this.
Oh,
so
okay.
could I ask you to do that?
Yes, I will do that.
Well, I hope everyone enjoyed this. I thought it was great. Thanks a lot for all your information and what you're doing. I'm Dr. Arlen Myers. I'm the president and CEO of the Society of Physician Entrepreneurs. If you're interested in joining us for more of these kinds of conversations and much more, we're at www.soapnet.org. Wendy, you might also want to post your email address.
Yes.
Or some place where people can get in touch with you.
Perfect.
I would remind you that if you go to the SOAP events page next week, actually tomorrow, if you're interested in digital health office hours, I'll put another link in the chat, and you can join us at the American Board of Artificial Intelligence in Medicine, where we'll be having you just go to that website and you'll see office hours tomorrow. And then the following week, we're going to have a series of 3 webinars on how to get your med tech idea to patients. So lots of stuff out there. And if you're interested, please join us. So I think you pretty much have posted what we want. So we'll adjourn. Thanks for joining us, and stay safe.
There's still no links for the that posted. Can you not shut it down right that quickly?
Actually, she did repost. I think she did repost it.
Yes, they are not links, they are PDFs, and
Okay.
they are
They're
in the
PDFs.
chat.
Right. Okay. And you can contact her by email for them. So thanks again, and stay safe.
Thanks.